Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is another one of the Energy Systems Engineering Institute lecture series. We hold these every other week at 4:30 in this very room. We are pleased today to welcome Khanjan Mehta. He is the Vice Provost of Creative Inquiry here at Lehigh University. He's also the Director of the Mountaintop Initiative. His work focuses on bringing students, faculties, and external partners together to enhance creative inquiry and individual project work. We're happy to steal him from Penn State, and he also has a new book, Solving Problems That Matter and Getting Paid for It, which tackles STEM careers in the theme of social innovation and global sustainable development. And he will be giving a talk today on energy in the developing world. So if we could give a great round of applause for him.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you, Dr. Shankar, for having me here. Good afternoon, folks. So I have about 40 minutes. Because at 5:15 sharp, I got to head out and give another 15-minute or 10-minute talk to the faculty in the College of Business and Economics. And I'm going to take my time to talk about challenges with energy in the developing world, the need, the challenges, and what does it take to get actual technologies and ventures on the ground and make them sustainable in the longer term. So I'm not going to talk as much about the technologies themselves, but I'm going to talk about the larger context and the various kinds of social, economic, political challenges that ventures run into. Right? I tend to speak pretty loudly, but I also speak pretty fast, and I speak with an accent. I've worked in over 20 countries. I've traveled more than 50 countries, for reviews and whatever else, and my accent is all mixed up. So at any point, if you don't know what I'm saying, just put your hand up and ask a question. Is that all right? So are you ready? Yeah? All right. So, how many of you are, oops, and this is not what I All right, so I'm going to talk about global development challenges. How many of you are familiar with the concept of the base of the pyramid? Some of you? So how many people in the world? About 7 billion? Yeah? Of those 7 billion people, you have over 1 billion that live on more than $60 a day. You have 1.4 billion that live on between $10 and $60 a day. 3 billion on $2 to $10 a day, and then you have over 1 billion people that live on $2 a day. Live on less than $2 a day. Right, and those numbers probably don't add up to the current world population of 7.4 billion, but here's the point. The ratios haven't changed. And traditionally, we've thought about people at lower levels of this pyramid as passive recipients of charity. And we thought that we're going to donate them out of poverty. That has had mixed results, and if you look at the history of development over the last 40, 50 years, you spend billions of dollars on projects that are fundamentally unsustainable. So a different narrative, one that was championed by C.K. Prahlad in his book, The Fortune at the Base of the Pyramid, said that instead of thinking about people at the base of this pyramid as passive recipients of charity, can we think of them as our partners and collaborators and work with them to, instead of giving them a hand out, give them a hand up and help pull them out of poverty. A lot of space here. Where coming from?
This is
it's the energy in the developing world. Is that what you want to do? Yeah, good. So that's the basic idea behind the fortune at the base of the pyramid. So over the last 15, 16 years, I've worked in a whole bunch of countries with people at the base of this pyramid on various energy projects, food systems, health systems, and so on. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges and some of the reasons why these projects fail. I'm an engineer by training. Some of my work is, I'm an electrical engineer by training, but my work is mostly in agricultural systems. So these are low-cost greenhouses. And we designed these over a 3-year span, and then we've commercialized them in a bunch of countries. So now we have 8 different organizations, either for-profits or social enterprises, that manufacture and sell these greenhouses in a whole bunch of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Or here are mushroom production systems we're working on in Cambodia. There's a team at Lehigh working on this, where these mushroom production systems cost about $600, and then local farmers in rural Cambodia purchase these, and then they will grow mushrooms, and they will recover that capital typically in 3, 4, 5 months. And right now we have 81 of these installed in rural Cambodia that produce about 2,000 kilos of mushrooms, and we're trying to scale it up from 2,000 to 5,000 kilos. And this is a student-run venture with a bunch of partners on the ground in Cambodia. Working on telemedicine systems on test strips to screen women for urinary tract infections. So we have a team at Lehigh working on this right now. The way we manufacture these is we take a piece of paper, take a foam stamp, dip it in these chemicals, stamp it on a piece of paper, and when you pee on it, it changes color. So you can manufacture these test strips for less than 2 cents. And that's a really affordable price point. But that's not the challenge. The challenge is getting these test strips in the hands of the women who need it most in these geographically dispersed communities at a price point they can afford. Right? So we actually have one of our team members who's in Sierra Leone right now, funded by Grant Challenges Canada, and she's testing out 10 different scenarios to see how we can get these test strips to the women who need them most. So the challenge is the last mile challenge about the execution. 3 different prosthetic devices. How many of you have seen these before? Some of you? Yeah, what do you think? Is that cool? Yeah, it's cool, but let me tell you this. This is pretty much a toy. We spent over 9 months studying it we did due diligence from every aspect, and we found that the only 2 entities that can use this are little children as a toy, or it actually works for pets. So if you have a pet cat that has a problem, you could design a limb for your pet cat or your pet dog as long as it's tiny. But otherwise, it's really not a useful device. So why it's not about the technology, it's a whole bunch of socio-technical issues. So in a sense, my experiences are in designing with communities and commercializing for markets. So let's talk about why ventures fail. So how many of you know what that is? Yeah? Anybody? So what is that?
So it's low-cost laptop.
It's a low-cost laptop. That's the MIT One Laptop Per Child project. They tried to design a $100 laptop, which when released cost about $200. And I've never, ever seen anybody on the ground actually use one of these. So it's a textbook case study on how it's a pretty interesting technology, but it never scaled. It never got to the end user. But how many of you know what that is? Yeah, so that's a life straw. How many of you have used one of these before? Anybody? Yeah, does it work? Yeah. I love it. It works really well. If you're out camping in Colorado and you need to drink water, it works. But can you imagine living in some sub-Saharan African country and this is how you go and drink water on a day-to-day basis? Is this how you would want to drink your water? This thing costs $30. Can you afford a $30 device? And you're going to go and drink water this way. So if you look at some of the newer products they have, they look like more traditional filtration systems designed for family use and not for individual use. So great technology, but it's not affordable to the end users. So who are its customers right now? It's mostly aid agencies. UN, when there's a disaster situation, whether it's an earthquake or tsunami or whatever, they'll buy these and give them to people for temporary use. Make sense? Or the D-Light. How many of you know what the D-Light is? Have you seen that? It's a solar lantern. It was designed by a team of students at Stanford. And this thing actually is being sold in all corners of the world. Not just in sub-Saharan Africa, all over Africa, but in Southeast Asia, Philippines, India, Bangladesh, they've made it all the way there. Because they consciously thought about how do we get them in the hands of the people. So this is a really transformative technology. So what are some of the challenges that ventures face trying to get to customers in the developing world? So that's a solar food dryer. So we know that 30 to 60% of the food grown in the world is wasted because there is no way to get it to a shelf-stable form. Right? So it's tomato time, it's orange time, and there are oranges everywhere. But you can eat only so many tomatoes. And then the rest of them just rot. But you can use a device or a technology, a product like this to desiccate the tomatoes and extend their shelf life. This thing worked really well, except that it cost $5,000, and that was way beyond what people could afford, and so it failed. So you have to design for specific price points. Anybody knows what that is? Anybody? Yes?
Water tank.
It's a water tank, and what is this? This is a merry-go-round that pumps water from an underground tank to the overhead tank. Right? This thing is called a play pump. And the idea was that kids would be playing on it and they would pump water. Sounds cool, they got great publicity, but it failed. Why? Why would it fail? What was their business model? How much did this thing cost? About $1,000. How many schools and orphanages can afford a $1,000 thing in their backyard? Very few. It's a mechanical system that requires maintenance. but the locals are not trained on doing that maintenance. And their business model was that they would put advertisements on that overhead tank, but very few people were interested, or companies were interested in advertising in the rural areas, and so that approach tanked, I guess. Right? Or actually, one of the other funny things was the kids stopped playing on it because it wasn't fun anymore, and then the women had to move it around and around to pump water, which is the last thing they wanted to do. Right? So you need to have a real business model. It should be desirable. So we actually had a team that designed a solar food dryer that can be put together by 2 people in 2 days for less than $200. We actually got it for $120. It worked beautifully. We went back to all these farmers we had consulted earlier. We said, look, here it is. And they said, good job, but we don't care because we are farmers. Drying is somebody else's job. Right? It's a question of identity. They didn't see themselves doing this as a secondary occupation, and it wasn't something that worked in the longer term. What's that? Is that an energy device? It's a solar stove, right? The solar cooker. You put your food in there, and it's a parabolic reflector. It works beautifully, right? It's an excellent high school project. But will people in developing countries actually use these? I love pizza. I love eating tofu and broccoli in Sichuan sauce, and I cannot imagine cooking either of them in this thing. Right? Our food is a really important part of our culture, and the texture, the way we cook it is really important to us. So the only place I've seen people use these in parts of South Asia to make rice with a specific texture. And you can put the rice and the water in there in the morning, and it's done by the end of the day. There are other reasons why people like open fires. Like you use it to smoke out your little home, or you use it to heat up your little home if you're living up in the mountains. And so people don't use these $500 technologies, but go back to burning wood. So does it meet every need? You need to look at it from a systemic perspective. Is it beautiful? As I told you, this is one of the beautiful greenhouses. In more than 24 countries, 26 countries now, we will actually take your money and sell you a greenhouse. That'll pay for itself in about 9 months. All the materials are locally sourced, except for the plastic covering that is imported from Israel. And we got a small grant from EPA to say, hey, what if we replace this glazing with some local materials? And we figured we could use rice bags, which were available everywhere, coat them with certain materials, and that would bring down the cost from $600 to $500. The selling price, not the cost price. We went back to the farmers, and they said, you know what, we'd rather pay $100 more, but have something that looks as nice as what our neighbors have. Those rice bags were not sexy for them. Your product needs to be sexy because if you have less money, you're going to put a lot more thought into how you're going to use that money. My thesis, and I've done some tests on it, is that every product is aspirational first, and then people think about the other value it creates for them. So you cannot leave aspiration out of the equation. Who's going to manufacture it? That's a very successful treadle pump made by a company called Kickstart, and it's called the Super Moneymaker. But is it manufactured locally in Kenya? No, it's manufactured in China, because if you try to manufacture it locally in Kenya, the price will probably go up by 3 times to 4 times, and it won't be affordable to the people anymore. So it makes a lot more sense to import it from China. Well, is your product going to hurt the environment? There are lots of great little things you can run and use them to make money that run off a lead acid battery in countries where there are no recycling systems. So do you support them? Do you not support them? Is your product technology, is your technology socially acceptable? Do you know what that is? Anybody? That's
Another water pump.
It's a water pump, it's a treadle pump. And when the women are working on it, it's pumping water from point A to point B. So instead of walking 4 hours when you are vulnerable, you could be working on this for 45 minutes and pump water from point A to point B. It's been a real game changer in many parts of the world, but in other parts of the world it's been rejected by the culture, by the communities. Why? Why would such a simple technology not align with the culture? Anybody? Yes?
Going for water is a social event.
Excellent, right? So going for water is a social event. That's your happy hour, you're walking with your friends, you're gossiping, you're catching up, you're talking about life, and now you're depriving them of that social event. What else? In some cultures, when the women get to the place where the water is, that's where the men are waiting for them, and that's how their courtship procedure works. And now you are, well, I would be really unhappy if I just keep waiting and the women never come. Right? In some cultures, when the women are working on it, the sway of their hips is considered provocative. And so some men are very unhappy about it. I'm sure there are others who are happy about it. But nevertheless, people go back to their old way of doing things. Do that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah? So you need to, your technology, your product needs to align with the cultural mores, with the understanding that culture is not static, right? Culture evolves, so we cannot museumify culture. And I can give you umpteen examples of technologies that have truly influenced the culture over time. Like, at least in Kenya, where I've done a lot of work, in many rural areas, men were very uncomfortable with women using cell phones. Now, everybody has a cell phone. In fact, on average, people have more than one cell phone. People will be walking around with 2 cell phones, sometimes 3 cell phones. Or they'll have a phone with multiple SIM cards, they can call in multiple networks. How will your product reach the people? That's your last mile challenge. Our greenhouses are a real game changer. We have farmers making over $100,000 with $1,000, $1,200 investment. Like, I'm ready to quit my job and move to Mozambique and start farming. Right? It's a really lucrative business. But it's difficult for them to get that initial capital and get the first greenhouse on their farm. There is no Amazon Prime, there is no Costco. How do you get your product to them? And how do you scale your product? If your goal is larger impact, scale cannot be an afterthought. It's something you have to think about from day 1 or day 0. Because solving a problem for 100 people versus 10,000 people versus 10 million people are 2 very different kinds of challenges. Right? So these are some of the questions that teams asking themselves as they're designing some of these new technologies and working with partners in developing countries trying to commercialize those technologies. So we also looked at this from a more formal perspective as to why projects fail. And we looked at food value chains and various technologies used along those food value chains from production to processing to storage, marketing, distribution, and consumption. Energy was implicated in many different ways, but I never think about energy as like an end goal. You know, energy is an enabler. Energy helps me do things better, faster, in a more profitable manner. So I never think of myself working in the energy space. Greenhouses are, it's about energy, but for me, it's about food. For my customers, it's about food, not about energy. Does that make sense? All right, so why do projects fail? We looked at over 120 ventures, and we looked at their life cycles from an idea to various kinds of pilots, to launching a venture, to reaching sustainability. So we looked at these 3 phases of design, implementation, and maturity. And we said, what are some of the reasons why these projects are failing or struggling? And here's what we found. We found that there were actually more than 26 different families of failures. I would often go to conferences and people would be presenting the technology and say, oh, and it failed for cultural reasons, or it failed for market reasons. But actually, if you look deeper, it's much more complex than that. It's like the classic Tolstoy, happy families are all alike, unhappy families are unhappy in their own ways. So when you look at ventures that are working, you see a lot of similarities. And when you see stuff not working, it's 100 different reasons. So reasons like, the most common one, it does not even meet a real need. Issues of manufacturability, usability, it's too complex, it doesn't align with the culture, it doesn't align with the context. Like those hippo rollers that you're using to transport water. And it's a big drum of water, it's cylindrical, and then instead of carrying it on your head, it's a roller and you just pull it. Sounds great, except that if you're going uphill, there's no way that's going to work. Or if you take it uphill and something snaps, it's going to take 10 people downhill off the world, right? So that's context and topography. The vast number of failures actually happen in the implementation phase. Challenges like access to capital, pricing. Sometimes products are priced too high, sometimes they're priced too low and people don't value them enough. Or strategic planning and pivoting. And then a whole bunch of reasons here like legal issues, team dynamics, competition management, quality control issues, partners and champions. But half these issues have nothing to do with the product or the market. They have everything to do with the team. And the team's ability to get us act together and keep going and keep working and keep pivoting until they are successful. So actually of those 120 ventures, more than 70 of them, their largest challenge was all about the team and managing the team and keeping them on track to deliver. And finally, you have a bunch of issues in maturity, the biggest one being standardizing the concept of operations. What does that mean? You go to a Chipotle, I love Chipotle, you go to Chipotle anywhere in the US, and they have the same, pretty much the same process, right? You go to a Subway, 32,000 Subway stores, they have exactly the same process. They have standardized it to deliver a standard customer experience. How do you do that with your products and services so that all of them are identical or reasonably identical? As you grow, you need to invest more resources to ensure uniformity, and that ends up costing you too much, and the price point goes up, and your customers can't afford it anymore. Because everything is transactional, everything it's all about micropayments. Right now, what is it going to cost me? And if people can't afford it, you're out of business. So, when we talk about sustainable and scalable solutions, it means 4 things. It means that your technology must be technologically appropriate, environmentally benign, culturally acceptable, and economically sustainable. All 4 aspects are just as important, and some of the largest challenges are around economic sustainability in the longer term. So, to kind of quickly zoom out, how do you identify new opportunities? A traditional approach would be you start with a community assessment and you map the assets and resources, and you start with a point, a place of abundance. What do we have in abundance, and how do we make the most of it? Actually, I love all of it. But where the rubber hits the road, the question is never what the problem is. The question is always, what is the problem for which you can design and actually deliver a sustainable solution? And those are the opportunities that we tend to pursue. Right? So it's not about problems, it's about opportunities. What is the smallest unit of value creation? And so what is value creation? So you're drying your tomatoes, drying your fish, drying your bananas. And you talk to a lot of engineers and they'll say, oh look, here's a cool new technology, here's a solar dryer. Yes, but that solar dryer by itself does not create value. It's about the process, because before you use the solar dryer, there's a bunch of pre-processing steps, there's a bunch of post-processing steps, and that process makes money for some individual. And that, how do you do that over and over again? That is the smallest unit of value creation. So we should not be focusing just on the solar dryer, but focusing on this process and designing the entire ensemble of what it takes to bring that process to life. And that involves a lot of education and training and capacity building and partnerships and, and whatever else. So, by the way, how many of you have seen that before? Some of you, that's a typical venture life cycle, right? It all starts with an idea, and then at some point you have prototypes, you pilot a bunch of things, at some point you launch your venture, maybe someday you'll actually go cash positive, you'll have some positive revenues, and that's your hockey stick curve, which never happens, right? So in the developing world, most of the times that curve looks like that. And it's very gradual, it takes time, it's a long-term game, except a few exceptions, but for the most part, that's what it looks like. And then at some point you may reach maturity, you reinvent yourself, or you die. So this journey from launching to reaching sustainable operations, that's where most of the issues come in. And that journey from point A to point B looks like that, right? You have to be responsive, you have to have good partnerships, you have to keep learning, keep pivoting. And if you're not pivoting, you're going to go obsolete. So it's all about execution. Ideas are worthless. So lots of students who come to me, hey, here's a good idea. I'm like, great, well, sure, it all starts with an idea, but let's think forward. How will this play out? Do lots of scenario planning, lots of validating the concept, the technology, the usability, the business model, and then piloting a whole bunch of technologies, business models, operational models, concept of operations or ConOps to get to that steady state. It's all about execution. So that's one here. The technology product is 10%. The other 90% is about venture creation. Some of our largest challenges are starting with 20 organizations. It all comes down to staffing, managing your overheads, sometimes legal issues depending on the country you're working in, yeah, it's all venture creation. So it's all about pivoting, and just that's one thing that is constant is to pivot and to keep pivoting until you're successful. Not forcing solutions, like those solar food dryers. I see that happen quite a bit where especially nonprofits come in and say, ta-da, here's this technology without any validation. And especially if people don't have skin in the game, that's not very likely to work in the longer term. Asking women and engaging women. So most of my work is focused on agriculture like horticulture, which is essentially a women's job, or on the other end of the society, I spend as much time with farmers as I do with doctors and nurses and community health workers. Or at least that's what I used to do before I moved to Lehigh. And no matter where you go, you really have to engage the women because they know the system so much more better because they are the primary stakeholders. Ask marginalized people. So this basic theory of community engagement. It's about equity, reciprocity, and finding who are the different stakeholders, who are the marginalized people, and how do you empower them and create a situation where there are as many winners. Ideally, all winners, but that doesn't always happen. And you never know what kind of opportunities you find. So here in Turkey, there's a cool venture where these folks figured out that it's actually more lucrative to put solar panels on cows and donkeys and send them up the mountains so people can charge their phones than the milk they were getting out of the cows. So it leads you to all kinds of new opportunities. You need good, solid business models. You need to create good incentive structures. This is a cool story. How many of you have heard of Greenlight Planet? Greenlight Planet. So that's another solar lantern company like T-Light. They've sold more than 1 million lanterns, mostly in southern India. And these kids, they're all American kids. And this one kid, they just had a test device. They were playing with it, and they wanted feedback from customers. And they set up a little thing under a tree. And this guy comes over and says, "I really want to buy this." He said, "No, we're not selling yet. We're not ready. We just want some feedback from users." He said, "No, I want to buy it," and he wouldn't give up. So they sold it to him for whatever, $10, and then they said, "Okay, well, we've sold it to you, but what will you do with it?" And he said, "Oh, I'm going to sell it to my neighbor and make a little profit." Right? So everybody has their own way of looking at those technologies, and if you create those incentive structures, it's more likely to sustain. Lots of challenges with regulation and certification. This is something we were working on with a university in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso called 2IE, and it was all about how there are all these solar panels, mostly from China, but also South Africa, coming and flooding the market. And people have pretty unreasonable expectations on what these solar panels can do for them. And there is no regulation, there is no certification of these solar panels. And so we're trying to develop this countrywide certification system, which is coming up as a larger and larger need. Because it's more about the design of systems with off-the-shelf components and the design of specific products. That's a huge unmet need. Lots of good questions come up on what's the role of government and how to engage the government best. We found, depending on the country, sometimes they can be very helpful, and sometimes all you want is for them to get out of the way and for you to run your work. You can't be successful unless you really think about communities and how this creates value for those communities, and whether it supports the local dynamics and social networks and trust within those networks, or it actually creates more tension. Some tension is good, but again, what is reasonable tension? You don't know that, but the local partners, especially the ones who've been working in a place for a long time, know what is doable, what's not. And so engaging them is critical.
I'm sorry. Can you give an example of how something caused tension?
Something caused tension? Sure. So one of my first projects a long time back, and I was really new at this, and geez, I'm an electrical engineer. This whole social stuff, I was really new to it. And we actually had a situation where we built these really low-cost windmills in Western Kenya, And our primary partner, they got death threats because they thought that we were giving them all this stuff and others were left out. And we had to do a lot of time, like a lot of PR in communities and show how this can scale over time. And we did scale it in a different way over time. But yeah, that's like lots of jealousy and just tension. And it's about being left out. So again, some very simple conversations which we should have done ahead of time, but nobody had educated us on how we should go about doing it. Made all the difference. All right, to wrap it quickly. In the longer term, it comes down to building that culture and value system. I'll give you examples. I've done a lot of work with former street dwelling youth in Kenya and helped design a program for the provincial government that gets these street children from all over the country to the center, and they get a good education and basic healthcare and whatever. And now these kids, so when I would be in Kenya, there would be students from my side, and then there would be all these former street youth who will be working on these ventures together. And these street children were way better at getting things done than some of the university students, frankly. And over time, they started becoming more and more innovative. And now they have a few ventures of new technologies like a hay baling system that they have created all by themselves. So that capacity, building that human capacity and creating that value system where trying new things, creative inquiry is kind of welcome and is something that is supported, can be truly transformative. And finally, you got to be realistic. There's a basic principle, at least for me, is self-determination. And you want to change the world, but there are a lot of people who don't want their world to be changed. And you have to absolutely respect that. So, to wrap up, the way I see the world, here's my little soapbox. How do you do things like these from an academic setting? It's all about interdisciplinarity, 24/7 nonstop action, and radical ownership. If you don't have radical ownership in the project, in the process, I don't see how you'll get there. First do, then learn, because then you learn what you need to learn. It's not about problems. There are lots of problems. Some are solvable, some are not solvable, but it's really about opportunities. An opportunity to go from point A to point B. Those test strips, those 2-cent test strips I told you about, the way we even started working on them was because we observed that in Sierra Leone, the incidence of diabetes was rising significantly, and the way that people were screened was in the middle of the courtyard in this clinic, there was a little slab of concrete, and men and women would go and pee on that slab of concrete in a pretty public place. And which is fine, I don't have a problem with it. If it works for the culture, hey, whatever. But the problem was that, how do you test it? If you have glucose in your urine, then ants are attracted to it. Right? So that's a pretty ingenious way, but it's not specific, it's not sensitive, and there are a whole bunch of reasons why it doesn't work for people who have disabilities or pregnant women. And so we said, how can we do better? And we came up with the 2-cent test strips. That does not diagnose, but it screens, and it takes us from point A to point B, which is a higher sustainable equilibrium. And you do a lot of these lateral moves over time. You'll look back and you realize how far you've come. It's like the way dinosaurs learned to fly, right? So it's a very gradual process with a lot of lateral innovation that leads to something truly transformative. It's not about activities, it's about outcomes, it's not about heroes. I'm very allergic to this narrative of heroes going in and changing the world. It's always teams, and it's always people who are focused on getting stuff done by doing, by influencing. It really takes a planet. It's not just about those solo entrepreneurs or innovators. They always work with larger systems. So we need more get stuff done. It's not about products, it's about ecosystems. Like none of our products would be successful if we didn't build a larger ecosystem around it. It's not about volunteers, it's about professionals. Not about silos, it's about convergence. Convergence of concepts, disciplines, cultures, countries, epistemologies, ways of thinking, doing, being. When those come together and you break down those barriers is when you truly innovate. It's not about one-offs. Life's too short for one-offs. It's about scalable solutions. It's not about communities. If you want to make larger change, you have to embrace the markets because they can move the needle. It's not just about passion, it's about rigor and evidence. Not about ideation, ideas are worthless. Most are, illegal, immoral. It starts with an idea, but ultimately it's all about execution. From a student perspective, it's not about GPAs, it's about portfolios of accomplishment, of what you have accomplished. That's going to get you a foot in the door or the next space in your career. And it's not about even outcomes, it's about launching careers, because there's actually a whole bunch of careers, and we need the next generation of game changers, whether you're talking about energy or food or healthcare or human rights or education. Right? These are huge opportunities to make change and make the world a better place. So don't create experiences, don't focus on experiences, focus on impacts, and let's collectively build a culture where we grade and celebrate accomplishment, then we focus on getting stuff done. So on that note, I'm going to open it up for questions, comments, and explanations. 30 minutes. Good. So we have about 12 to 15 minutes left. If you want to. Yes.
Do you think these lessons can be applied in scenarios where you're not necessarily starting your own company, but you're just working within a bigger structure?
Absolutely, right? So I really believe it's about change making, and that applies in all kinds of organizations. And sometimes the challenges are larger and the opportunities are larger in large organizations that have never thought differently. But they have enormous resources and enormous access. Yes, sir.
So I noticed you were mostly talking about sort of smaller scale decentralized implementations. Is it fair to say that you sort of believe that that bottom part of the pyramid is better going to be helped by decentralized soft pass kind of solutions versus your large scale infrastructure solutions, especially in energy?
Especially in energy? No, actually over time, I've seen more and more, ultimately when the grid comes in and they stabilize over time, they have the largest impact. But I also see how they are not totally independent. So for example, you look at Sierra Leone, where some parts of the country have pretty decent power and the rest of them are like totally out there, absolutely no power. But even so, I remember the first time I was in Sierra Leone for 3 months in this tier 2 town of McKinney, there was no power, period. 3 months, no power. And that's what we lived through, and we did great. But if you look at how they use power, these are all scratch card systems, and it's designed to be, the infrastructure is central, but there is still this element of healthy decentralization where everybody has a way of using that resource, if that makes any sense. So I think we're moving towards central with these kind of carved out piecewise linear models, if I may. Yes?
My sister is actually starting her own sea turtle conservation company in Puerto Rico, and she's fresh out of college. So I was wondering if you had any recommendations for her.
Wow. Well, I applaud and admire her courage to go out and try to do this. Hats off to her. It's hard. It's really hard, right? So a lot of kids come and tell me, I want to start this and start that. The first thing I tell them is, why don't you look at who else is doing what? Do a basic ecosystem map and see where the synergies might be, because right now you probably, you want to make change, you don't care about how much you get paid, but over time, you'll probably think differently. And the best way to make changes is not necessarily the most obvious one, to start your own organization. So frankly, I would be happy to chat with her one-on-one if that could be helpful, yeah.
Khanjan, if I may ask a question, it's we're all concerned about climate change, and climate change is going to affect the least developed countries the most. So I'm looking at the bright side. Are there going to be innovations that we can't even comprehend is going to make their life easier?
I mean, if you look at these greenhouses, actually a lot of our funds for the greenhouses come through ways climate change funds, because from a farmer's perspective, that's one of the easiest, simplest, very practical way of addressing climate change stressors, right? So I see a lot of innovations happening in this space, whether it's securing water for food, and whatever else. So yeah, I'm pretty optimistic, and I see a lot of people working really hard trying to come up with new technologies and business models, trying that. And also with the design thinking approach, where they're not just doing it in a vacuum, but they're actually spending a good bit of time on the ground, talking to people, engaging them in that process. And frankly, did we do that 50 years back, 10 years back? I don't think so. And that's changing, and that to me is very encouraging. That it's really about co-creation of value. Well, if you don't have questions, I'm going to ask you questions. So you invested 45 minutes of your life in this talk, so thanks for coming. But what did you learn? Give me your takeaways. Anybody?
The bigger pictures of what needs to go into making something that's successful, and what the definition of successful means.
Yeah. What else? Okay, yeah.
I thought it was really interesting how a lot of things that you look at them and think, wow, it's an amazing idea, but you never think, kind of like what you said, like big picture, about how when you don't think about all like different aspects of the implementation, like actually getting it out there, like how they can fail so easily.
Yep. What else? Come on, guys. Yes.
I like your relation to always ask the woman what her opinion is. I think that's.
So, do you know who Guy Kawasaki is? Guy Kawasaki is a really well-known venture capitalist, and he has this talk, he has a book on the art of the start, and he has a 40-minute video, like a talk on the art of the start. And 40 minutes, I would strongly encourage you to go watch that talk. So it's about whatever you want to start, it's really a bunch of very practical lessons on the art of the start. And he talks quite a bit about why you should ask women, never ask the men, always ask them. But I don't want to be too sexist.
Observation, understanding, you know, when we were talking about why didn't they want to use the pump because of the social aspects and the courting and all that. So observing before you come up with a solution.
Yep. So typically, we would spend close to a year, sometimes more, sometimes a little less, just identifying new opportunities, spending a lot of time taking more ethnographic approaches to understand how people, how communities work, how cultures work, how markets work, and then very gradually, through relationships, kind of entering the game. It's a very gradual process, and I'm very kind of skeptical of like, you know, these parachute in, parachute out kind of approaches, because I've never seen them work. So absolutely, hit the nail on the head. What else? All right, give me two more, I'll get out of here. Yes, sir.
You pointed out some projects or products that I thought were successful that weren't, so I learned something there.
Seems there are a lot of like, nice high-tech solutions that people come up with, but those decisions are made in a vacuum. That's why they end up not working or even wanted when they get implemented.
Absolutely, right? So the challenge is not in the complexity, the challenge is in the simplicity. The challenge is in designing really simple solutions that can work. Yeah.
My daughter and I built a solar hot dog cooker when she was in elementary school. That didn't really go too far either. It's in the closet.
But I'm sure there's a lot of capacity building that happened as you were doing that, right? So that's valuable in its own right.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, cool. Any other last words? Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned you had a great experience in Kenya and a lot of the development over there. And as far as we see, China's doing a lot of infrastructure investment in the entire Africa pretty much. So how is it going in terms of energy consumption, energy creation? And do you think there's a potential cooperation between further development in Africa?
I mean, yeah, so it's a really interesting point and question and dynamic, but yeah, China is playing an extremely large role across the African continent. And so I've been traveling, I've been practically spending about 6 months in Africa over the last 15 years. It's a pretty substantial time, right? I'm here for half the year, I'm in Africa over the other half. And Africa has 54 countries, but I'm in a whole bunch of countries, so I think I have the privilege of just saying Africa together. And all these countries in East Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, Chinese presence has increased quite substantially in many good ways, but also in extremely tangible ways where you see the roads and the malls are funded by the Chinese, whereas the Americans are funding the healthcare system. So you ask people, what do they see the malls, they don't see the healthcare system, that kind of goes in hiding. But they see the energy infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, the malls emerge. And that's a really interesting dynamic. Because then you get into like mining. So I work in Sierra Leone quite a bit, and they are in a real mess because after Ebola, the mining operations shut down, and that was their primary source of revenue to keep the government running. And when that was gone, it was mostly Chinese mining companies. They've had a lot of soul searching on what do these relationships, what should they look like to be independent. So I'm definitely digressing here, but that's a big question and dynamic and lots of opportunity and a few challenges. So, all right, well, thank you so much for coming and thanks for having me here.